to anyone watching, and welcome to another Kaijudo video. Today, I know it's been a while, but I wanted to do another deck profile, and this time on the Light Nature Haven deck that I've been looking at over, I guess, like the last week or so, and been putting a little bit more time into tuning. I just want to say from the start that this deck is pretty heavily inspired and taken from Joshua Heater's Light Nature Haven list that he used to top 8 the Open Open. Um, I really like the look of his list as just like a clean ramp Haven deck, and so I took that. And this is maybe like the second or third iteration of the deck. His list was 43 cards to start. I trimmed down to 40 from his original list, and then played a little bit with it, changed some cards, and then this version here, I just made probably the biggest changes, and then this is the list I have, and then I'll go over the card choices, and then cover a lot of the other options here that I have as well. So, starting with the blockers, Ironwool Tree and Lemon. Ironwool Tree, not the biggest blocker, very small body, but it still does a good job of holding back the creatures like Cyberscamp, creatures like Blaze Belcher, a lot of the small 2-drops that Rush decks might put out. So it does a fine enough job as a blocker. Not very good against things like Swordhorn and Lost Patrol, but not many cards are anyways. So if you're not a deck with Strider, like your blockers are not going to be that big anyways. There's not a huge difference between 2500 power and 3000 power for something like Kraken. So it's not the biggest deal, and the main benefit here is you get a much better card and a really important option against any of the darkness decks like Kalima, Pile, basically anything with Mesmerize, Spire Puppet, Maddening Whisper, Skull Shatter, all of those darkness removal or darkness discard spells. So Ironwool Tree, pretty key part of some of the harder matchups for this deck. So it's really strong to be able to lean on this card. Full Metal Lemon, just another strong blocker. Can be a little bit slow at 3 mana, but it still does a good job. Really powerful for just chump blocking things like evolutions to protect your shield count, and then you still maintain the card that you put in because it goes back to your mana zone, which not only gets you back that resource, but it also can put you ahead on mana over your opponent. So it functions almost like a ramp spell as well. So just powerful blockers, maybe a little bit light on the blocker count. But the next card, just the next kind of the last like sort of generic creature in the deck is Lyra. It's not at its best in this deck compared to other decks, or it's not as important of a card as it is in other decks. We're not really leveraging it the same as like a tempo deck or a dragon deck is, where it's kind of, I mean, dragon deck they're abusing a ton of synergies with it. A tempo deck will use it as like the top end of their curve. It's just like a really powerful creature to take something the opponent's doing out of the way and using it really proactively. Here we're just using it as sort of like a defensive bridge card. It's just such a powerful mid-range tool, just being able to play it, tap something down, deter anything like, even just giant creatures like Swordhorn and Lost Patrol. Does a good job deterring those. It can lock down evolutions that are giving you problems, things like Anjak to buy you the time to hit Andromeda and Cassiopeia Haven to invalidate those big creatures like evolutions. When you have so much ramp, it's nice to have like just a powerful mid-range card that you can play that's not just more ramp. It just gives you that powerful play. Similar to Blinder Beetle Prime, but I can talk about this card a little more later on. But yeah, just basically just using it as a powerful bridge. The ramp spells, I have quite a big ramp package in this deck. One of the major differences is how I've like added a little bit more ramp than was in I think Josh's original list with the energizes here. I cut away from like the Blinder Beetle Prime Chasm Entangler package for it. I would say it's probably more likely that the Blinder Beetle Prime is like the correct card to play. But my thinking was, I mean, Energize is not even the worst against any of those aggressive matchups. Getting the extra Shield Blast kind of Sprout-esque card just gives you a little more. It's still a really strong card to have in shields in those aggressive matchups. So it does a little work there, and it's just, in my opinion, it was like the more on-plan card. It lets you just double down on this aggressive or this proactive ramp strategy, and it just makes that a little more consistent. I was finding like games where I would play Blinder Beetle Prime, it would be a powerful card, and it gives me powerful interaction against my opponent. But one of the things that felt like happening was I was putting all my eggs into this Blinder Beetle Prime basket to try to use it as interaction, and I would end up with just without the resources to hit up to the land drop. So I felt like I might as well just be using those cards to just develop my mana presence and play that proactive plan into Andromeda and Haven rather than trying to mess around with some interactive cards like Blinder Beetle Prime. That said, like Blinder Beetle Prime is still a strong card, and I think it's still probably worth playing, but I wanted to try out going a slightly different direction. The Reap and Sows and Mana Storms are very important cards as well. Just being card advantage pieces, developing two resources out of one card, which I think is another important thing here. In the matchups where your opponent's attacking you, you usually don't have much of a problem hitting your land drops, developing your mana while interacting with your opponent because they're giving you so many extra cards. But in matchups when your opponent's holding back, trying to set up a bigger board, and then maybe land a Finbar, or in the matchups where your opponent's just playing a defensive deck and they're not going to attack you, you want to avoid situations where you run out of cards in hand by like turn 6 or 7, and then you're just draw mana passing every turn. Those games just don't go great for you a lot of the time, and that leaves you kind of vulnerable. Your opponent can do more, can just do more effective things than that. So it's important to have cards like Reap and Sow that can find you 2 lands out of 1 card, or Mana Storm 2 lands out of 1 card, so that you can not only get ahead in land drops, but also get the cards to actually make further land drops and find your big things as well. So just having that card advantage is really important. I can talk a little bit later, I suppose, about like the difference between Earthbound Giant and Mountain Storm. But carrying on with the deck, we have the sort of the interactive Shield Blast. A lot of them are just all centered around kind of basically just AoE style effects. They can all remove multiple attackers. They're all pretty powerful against small creatures. Tendril Grasp can deal with things even as big as Laser Arm Drakon, Neuron, Swordhorn, Lost Patrol. And it's just one of the more powerful sweepers in the game. Arbiter, just a super powerful card as well. Has a lot less variance than Stormspark, just getting the body out of it. Even though I'm not using the body as well without Blinder Beetle Prime, it's still strong, still can attack over a bunch of creatures. If you're playing it against a rush deck and they break a shield, even if you can't tap anything, the 2500 body is still relevant. And in the late game, it's also just a nice removal tool when you have a bunch of extra big creatures in play. It's still nice to have the option. So Arbiter is just a really strong card and very powerful against aggressive decks. Sumo Artichoke as well. It might look a little bit out of place. There's not really like the synergies around it like a veggie deck has. And it's not a situation where you're kind of forced into playing it like with Mono Nature, where you just don't really have any other Shield Blast options that are anywhere close to as good as Sumo Artichoke, especially as just like a creature Shield Blast. But in this deck, we don't need it to be a creature, so we don't need to play Artichoke. But it's still just, I think it just always overperforms as a Shield Blast. With so much spell-based ramp, Scamp can be a bit of an issue sometimes, especially if they can answer your blockers. But with both Arbiter and Artichoke, you can just really easily deal with Cyber Scamp. Now, Artichoke is a little more vulnerable if they are able to play things like Swordhorn and Lost Patrol that can beat over Artichoke. So there's a little bit of variance there, but it's still just, I think it's just such a powerful Shield Blast. And it can just completely destroy Rush, because not only can it just prevent all their future attacks out of the Rush deck, basically being like a Stormspark Blast in that sense, where it just effectively taps their whole team. It also can then attack over one of their creatures, and then eat their following turn's attacks. And even if they have like a Gila Flame or a Wildfire Valkyrie that can trade with or beat over the Sumo Artichoke, they still have to invest basically their whole next turn dealing with the Artichoke, it's such a huge tempo swing against so many of the rush decks. So I think Artichoke is just, it always overperforms, and it's really strong as a card in my opinion. So it gets the nod for me here. I think noting, I think Joshua's list, he played 2 Tendril Grasp, 2 Artichokes, and 3 Storm Sparks, and I went a little bit heavier on the Grasp and Artichokes. I think his deck was a little bit light when it came to nature, or yeah, a little bit low when it came to the nature mana count. So I wanted to up those, which is part of why my initial, I think, variant when I played his list, I actually cut down to 1 Storm Spark, and I just bumped up the numbers of Tendril Grasp and Artichoke. In my most recent iteration, I just went back up on a Storm Spark. I could see anywhere from 1 to 3 being correct. It's a powerful card. It's really great to have the option. Sometimes all you need is that like 1 extra turn to be able to land an Andromeda and then stabilize, land a Haven and stabilize, even Cassiopeia. It's also just, I mean, it's kind of a lucky thing to have happen, but it's always really nice to drop an Andromeda, luckily throw down a Storm Spark, and then have your opponent get to stabilize even further. When they break the Storm Spark, you tap your team, then you get to beat over something with Andromeda, land a Haven. Like, Storm Spark's just a nice card to have, helps deal with hexproof. It's a nice castable card as well when you're able to use something like a Lyra to trade off with a Laws. Laws can be pretty decent against this deck as well with all the spell-based ramp, but I'm not super in love with Storm Spark. I think it's a little bit less good. I think it's like, I mean, it's a really strong card, so I'm gonna play it no matter what. I just don't know exactly what number of copies is right. It could totally be correct that 3 is the right numbers, but again, his list was playing 43 cards, and I think Storm Spark was the third Storm Spark was also, it was definitely on the short list for like cards to trim down to 40. So we'll see how that performs going forward, but Storm Spark's still just a powerful card. And then the huge creatures here, not much to talk about. I mean, they're all just busted. Andromeda, Haven just invalidate so much stuff. And the 3 Cassiopeia of note is just really, really strong as well. Being able to chain Cassiopeia into Cassiopeia is just completely devastating. You can just really quickly turn the corner if you want to. You can just, it just makes it so much more likely that you're able to stabilize. Like, they just basically lock your opponent out for multiple turns. Like, it help you clear board. It's just such a powerful card, and having 3 Cassiopeia really gives you a shot against the pile decks as well. Makes it that much more likely you're kind of able to win the Haven War. So yeah, 3 Cassiopeia is one of the things I loved about this deck when I was playing it. So I'm really, really into that, and I wouldn't change anything about this. And that's sort of the main deck here. I guess the main omission was just Blinder Beetle Prime, I think, and Chasm Entangler. Chasm Entangler, I don't think the extra blocker is nice against some of the aggressive rush draws, like when they have multiple 1-drops. Being able to have like Chasm Entangler when you're going second is pretty strong, but I mean, moving up to 3 Artichoke and 3 Tendril Grasp kind of mitigates that. I don't think it's like super necessary to have all these extra 1-mana blockers. They're nice, but not necessary. Blinder Beetle Prime, I think, again, it's probably more likely correct to have it in the deck. It's such a powerful card. Helps a lot versus like the tempo and the dragons decks even. Just super good there. I just felt like, for the most part, I just felt like I wanted to be able to just more consistently pursue my proactive game plan of just ramping into big things. And I felt like Blinder Beetle Prime was ending up in my mana zone a fair amount, so I could accomplish that, and then it would have been nice to just have more ramp as options. I'm still experimenting with it, not sure if that's correct or not, but that's sort of what I've gone with. Again, one of the other reasons to omit the Blinder Beetle Prime, although maybe not a huge one, is just like the actual mana count for nature. If you incorporate Blinder Beetle Prime and Chasm, it's going to dig into some of these ramp spells, probably the Energize, which I think like you would probably cut the 3 Energize and like this Iron Will tree. Maybe you'd have to trim on an Artichoke, or like it basically really diminishes the number of nature cards you have in your deck and makes it that much harder to cast your Lemon on curve, cast your Sprout on curve. So I'm not a huge fan of that. Again, it's tough to say where the to actually draw that line in terms of what's correct or not, but I sort of like this approach a little bit more. The other card, I'm actually a big fan of it, is Earthbound Giant. When I first played the deck, or when I first saw Earthbound Giant, I kind of underrated it. I thought it was not super good. When I actually played with it, it definitely overperformed my expectations. It's definitely a strong card for sure. I just felt like there were too many spots. Like, just immediately getting the mana back off of Mana Storm was just, it's just too good. Like, it is a spell. Mana Storm's a spell, which can be a drawback in some matchups, but like, it's just, I felt like it was just, again, the more like consistent, proactive, on plan card was Mana Storm. Like, Earthbound Giant is just a more interactive card. Like, it does a good job hosing certain strategies even. Like against a mono nature mid-range deck, which doesn't have any interaction really for it until they get up to Boulder Fist. I mean, like you can just, it basically hoses their game plan where you can get just as much extra mana as they do, and then you can, but you're usually going to be the one to leverage that mana first. So Earthbound Giant can do a really good job there, even against something like Wild Veggies. If you're able to play it on just a turn ahead of schedule, you go energize into, if you were to go energize into Earthbound Giant, play it on turn 4. If you do that going into their bad apple turn, all of a sudden, when they would normally just go 2-drop, 3-drop bad apple, get 2 cards or ramp twice off of the bad apple, now all of a sudden, like, they're giving you 2 extra land drops. They probably, like, can they even make that play? Probably not, because you're the one that's going to untap with that mana first. Like, it's just, it can kind of hose those strategies, and it's also very strong against like any control ramp mirror like this. Like if you're playing against any similar deck to this, it's just like a ramp heavy Haven build, it's just going to do a ton of work hosing that. Like if you look at our list, we're pretty weak to Earthbound Giants coming from the opponent, so that could be something to think about. And Blinder Beetle Prime could be worth playing just to answer opposing Earthbound Giants. But with all that said, like I still just think Mana Storm, for as good as Earthbound Giant is in like a mirror match like this, or against the pile decks that are playing Sprout and Reap and Sow, like Mana Storm is just as good. And like they don't have the ability to play around Mana Storm like they can adapt their game plan to play around Earthbound Giant and try to answer it first. So like they can find, your opponent can usually find ways to not give you the mana out of Earthbound Giant. It's hard to do, which is why I think the card is good enough to play to begin with, beyond just being a card that hoses other strategies. But I just think being able to consistently get that mana is what you want out of a ramp spell, and that's why I've elected to go with Mana Storm. Of note, I should say that I think Wildstrider Ramnoth is just not worth playing. I think it's clearly worse than Earthbound Giant. I just think you're just so much more likely to actually get the first mana back off of Earthbound Giant than you are out of Ramnoth, just because like they have to play their mana before they play their spells, and like they can so easily answer Wildstrider. On top of that, like yeah, you can play a Wildstrider on turn 4 with some draws. Like you can go Sprout into this, into Ramnoth. You can go Sprout into Reap and Sow into Ramnoth. So you can definitely play it on turn 4. But that said, you're going to play Earthbound Giant enough more often on turn 4 that it's worth like losing that 1,000 power of creatures it might be able to contest. So I think, and again, I just think it's like so much more likely because you're able to untap it with it on turn 4 more consistently. They have, and like you're just going to get the mana off of it more often as well, because like they have to play their spells before they, if they want to Rusalka it, they're going to have to hit their land drop to play the Rusalka, or hit their land drop to play the Finbar. So I think it's just a better card than Ramnoth in my opinion. I wouldn't come close to putting a Ramnoth in this deck. I think it's just clearly worse than Mana Storm. Like, I'd rather play third Mana Storm. I'd rather play any copies of Earthbound Giant. So that's my thoughts on that. Some of the other cards here, again, you could play third Stormspark's totally on this table. Another card I forgot to add here is actually Root Trap. Root Trap could definitely be a playable card as well. I definitely, most of this, again, this removal is mostly concentrated around like dealing with cheap creatures, shoring up the aggressive matchups, making those easier, and then relying on just Cassiopeia and Haven to deal with any of the top end things coming out of your opponent. And I think that's probably enough. Like, Root Trap's definitely on the table, but I just don't think it's really necessary. Better to have like more effective cards against like the draws that can cause problems. Raincod Kraken was another card posed. You could play it alongside Blinder Beetle Prime if you go that direction. I just think it can be nice to help make the Blinder Beetle Prime a little more consistent, which is another one of my issues with the card. Is like when I was playing it with 6 bait, it wasn't always lining up properly, especially if my opponent, like if I was playing the Dragon matchup and my opponent just doesn't necessarily have to attack my shields until they're set up with like some birds and or a Keeper of Laws or Herald into Finbar. Like, dragons can sit back, generate some resources, and set up a battlefield. And if they're not giving me the extra cards out of shields, it can be hard to assemble Blinder Beetle Prime, and then it ends up not really accomplishing that much anyway. So buffing the Enforcer count can be pretty beneficial there. That said, like, Iron Will Tree is just too important in some of your harder matchups, and I don't think those hard matchups like Pile are so bad that you should just avoid playing any cards for them. Like, they're close enough, you have enough of a shot that it's worth playing Iron Will Tree to give yourself an even stronger shot in those matchups. And I think, like, I just don't think Rain Cloud's worth playing over Iron Will Tree for the amount Iron Will Tree will benefit you in other matchups. Other than that, Keeper of Laws, another card I could totally see playing to help shore up the Pile matchups. The problem is it just doesn't really do anything super on plan. It's really not that great in any other matchups beyond that. So, like, maybe it could get in over Stormspark or something like that. I could see it as an option, but without a ton of creatures, you're not even protecting it that well. So if you're just playing a naked Keeper of Laws and hoping it's going to accomplish something against control, they can pretty easily just play a Lyra to deal with it. And, like, you don't really want to commit a lemon to the battlefield against a control deck just to give your Keeper of Laws hexproof. Like, it's just, I just don't think it's really going to get there, but it is an option. Grand Gear was another card Joshua Heater played in his list. It was one of like the first few cards. Like, his deck was 43 cards again, like I said, and I think the first 3 cards I cut to get it down to 40 was the Ramnoth, the Grand Gear, and like maybe one of the Stormsparks. And I suppose it's like pretty decent against like any of the mid-range evolution decks. It's pretty decent against dragons. It can beat over basically every dragon that's not their 9 mana plus ones. Like, it'll kill everything from Herald to Skycrusher. I just don't think it's really good enough to play, unfortunately. I have a soft spot for Grand Gear. I like the card. I like the card a lot. Back in like the early days of Kaijudo, it was one of my... I always had a soft spot for it, but like, even against like the mid-range evolution decks, like, you just have a good enough game just ramping into Cassiopeias and just trying to do that. Like, I don't really want to take a turn off to try to play Grand Gear against dragons. Like, most dragon decks will just have piercings and Finbars that just embarrass this card anyways. Lyra embarrasses this card. I just don't think it lines up well enough. It is really huge, especially when you have a Haven out, so that's kind of redeeming, but I just don't think it's good enough to play. It's a nice card, but I just don't think it really lines up well. The last 2 cards I can kind of touch on here, just some extra top end stuff. Kurugar is definitely a sweet card. With all this top end and all the ramp spells, it might look appealing, but I just don't think this kind of card is worth playing. you have to untap with it to be good. Um, and it's just not worth playing because of that. Like, it's just not worth the slot in the deck. You want everything to be like defensive cards, ramp spells, like again defensive shield blast, and then what the giant payoffs that you want to play should be able to affect the board and catch you up. And Kurgar doesn't really catch you up. It doesn't really affect the board until you untap with it, and at that point, like, yeah, there's too much interaction that just makes it not accomplish anything. So I just don't think this kind of card is ever worth really playing. And similar to Caius. Caius can do a little more towards stabilizing you on the battlefield, for sure. Like, being able to potentially have like some shield blasts or get some shield blasts you wouldn't otherwise have can be a way to deter your opponent's attacks and help you get that extra untap. On top of that, being an 8 mana card is actually pretty appealing as something to curve into naturally with Mana Storm. So I kind of like it for that purpose. The problem is when you like think about the games that might play out with Caius, like, it's still the only way it's going to accomplish anything is if your opponent can't remove it, and if they can't remove it, like, they probably don't have many cards, or their battlefield's not huge or something. Like the good scenarios for it is your opponent doesn't have an out. They have maybe 2 or 3 cards and creatures in the battle zone. You have like 3 shields. Like, you have enough shields to where it actually does something. And then, like, because if you have 1 shield, they're just going to go for game, and they're probably going to get there. If you have 3 shields, then, like, yeah, it's going to deter their attacks. But, like, you have 3 shields, they have, like, nothing that can interact with it. Chances are, in those spots, they weren't going to attack you anyways, right? It doesn't matter. Like, they're not all of a sudden... Like, they're scared of you having an Andromeda and shields in those spots, whether or not you have Caius. Like, if there was no Caius on the battle zone, they wouldn't be able to attack you because they run the risk of giving you an Andromeda out of shields, and then you get to untap and play that Andromeda. The fact that you're now threatening to get that Andromeda into play for free with Shield Blast doesn't really change that equation. Your opponent's probably still not attacking you. So I think a lot of those games, Caius just doesn't really accomplish much, even if it does stick around, and the fact that it has to stick around just makes it, again, not really worth the slot, not really worth the inclusion. I'd rather maybe play stronger, cheaper interactive cards like Blind Beetle Prime. I'd rather play more on-plan ramp stuff like Earthbound Giant. So I guess those are my general thoughts on the list and some of the cards and the options and such. I guess on the whole, the matchups for this deck, I mean, I think it has a lot of good matchups. I think against all of like the aggressive decks, tempo decks, even dragons, like, most of your matchups go from like strong favorite to slight favorite. Like, I think you're probably a slight favorite against like the dragon decks, some of the tempo decks as well. It kind of depends on the draws there, but even like the rush decks, you're probably a little bit more of a heavy favorite, but it kind of depends on the build. Yeah, you're anywhere from like a strong to slight favorite, and like the major weak matchups are going to be, or this deck also will crush like any like kind of mopey mid-range decks. Like the aggressive ones like Mono Nature might be able to race you and get under you, but like because that deck's like fast enough. But any like kind of mopey mid-rangey deck, this deck will just go clean over the top of with all of its ramp and giant things. The toughest matchup by far is probably just going to be like the pile control matchup, where they have havens, they have maybe their own ramp spells, they have discard spells, and then reverberate is also a huge problem as well, because you can't really interact with reverberate. So a lot of the time what ends up happening in those games is like, sure, you can try to land an Ironwill tree. Ideally you land an Ironwill tree and you just have enough ramp that you can get under them, play a haven, then maybe try to race them. But the problem is like they can just terrapit away all your Cassiopeias, they can deal with your Andromedas. Andromeda can even be a liability to cast sometimes because you run so low on cards in deck that they can just turn the corner. They can stabilize with some havens and then their own Andromedas and then just deck you out. Like a lot of the time the pile deck can just deck you. Um, so Andromeda can just even be a liability, and there are spots where you can't even afford to cast it because of it will the mandatory effect to put the top cards of your deck into your shields. So I think they can pretty easily run you out of like relevant threats. And then the big thing is just winning the Haven War. Now you have a good shot at doing that if you can land your Havens and land your Cassiopeias, but the problem is like when they have Reverberate and their own ramp, they can get to their Haven fast enough and they can usually find more of them, and they have enough other cards in their deck that they're able to leverage them a little bit more effectively. So when you're relying on the top of your deck to find you your Cassiopeias and your Havens, they already have all those set up. They can access them with memory. So despite having more Cassiopeias, you'd think you would win the Haven War, but it doesn't actually play out that way, I think, often enough. And the games you don't have Tree and they're just able to take away your Mana Storm, or if you were playing Earthbound Giant, take away that. Take away every time they can discard a Haven from your hand, it just makes it that much more unlikely that you can win the matchup at all, because if there are any number of Havens up on you, like their Havens are going to be bigger, so it makes Cassiopeia just irrelevant anyways. Like it gets pretty tough. So the pile matchups are really the most difficult, I would say. But you have a plan and you can try to get there, and you can get there for some amount of the time, I would imagine. So, but yeah, a lot of the other matchups, like there will be some close matchups, probably around 50-50, but I think enough that you're a slight favorite and a bunch more that you're pretty strong favorite. So I think this deck is actually one of the better decks in the open format. From, again, not a ton of experience behind it, but I think it definitely has potential to be up there. But yeah, with all that said, a bit long-winded of a video as usual, but let me know anyone's thoughts on the archetype, what cards they might consider that I didn't, what cards they might add to the list, take out, what they might change about the configuration, whether or not they think Binder Beetle Prime's worth it, how good they think Earthbound Giant. Yeah, any thoughts on the deck in general, just let me know. I would love to hear. As always, thanks for watching the video, and we'll see you next time. Bye.